Hello and welcome to this special episode of Generation 16, where I attempt to rank the 42 games included on the Genesis Mini. Let's get started. The Genesis was a hugely important console, and I'm so happy that Sega is honoring the 30th anniversary of what is arguably its greatest success by releasing a mini console that rivals anything else on the market. Now I just need to get my hands on that mini Tower of Power. The Genesis Mini console is just like what we've come to expect after Sony and Nintendo did the same thing. It's USB powered, it outputs HDMI, I believe, to 720p, and of course it comes with two 3-button Genesis controllers in North America, which are USB controllers, so of course you can take advantage of all the two-player action in the games included. Alright, let's get on with the list. You can almost always count on Virtua Fighter 2 on any Genesis compilation, and I just can't figure out why. The only thing this game ever had going for it was its title. A terrible, terrible downgrade of a true arcade classic. Sonic Spinball is a clever idea that feels like it just didn't have enough time in the oven. It was essentially created to save the 1993 Christmas season from being completely Sonicless, but it fails to live up to the standards set by the first two games in the series. I get why Altered Beast is here. This is the game most pre-Sonic Genesis owners got as a pack-in, and it was pretty darn impressive looking back in 1989, but gameplay-wise it felt a bit dated right out of the box. Gravity puzzlers were all the rage back in the late 80s and early 90s, and so there are 3 of them on the Genesis Mini. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine is my least favorite. I think I'd like it a bit more if the difficulty were turned down a few notches. When Sega couldn't have Tetris on the Genesis, they bought the rights to Columns instead. That's right, this game was not a Sega creation, but rather designed by an American named Jay Geertsen. And while it carried the puzzler torch for Sega at the time, it doesn't hold a candle to a good game of Tetris. I know there are people who love the Alex Kidd games, but I've never been one of them. I've grown to appreciate Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle a bit more in my old age, but the single-hit kills and boss battles that rely purely on a chance game of rock, paper, scissors don't do this title any favors. Eternal Champions is a game that suffers mostly from the fact that it's just way too hard to play. Not only is the difficulty too high, but the moves are generally too tough to pull off properly, especially using the included 3-button controller. Sega had a potential franchise with these characters and gave it a good shot, but ultimately Eternal Champions never went anywhere. Kid Chameleon eschews visual flair for an overload of levels and gameplay mechanics. If you dig this type of platforming, Kid Chameleon delivers something like 99 levels of it. Personally, I could never get into this game. Kind of like Altered Beast, I totally get why Space Harrier II is on the Genesis Mini, seeing as it was one of the first games launched with the Mega Drive in Japan. This version is still enjoyable, but there have been too many better conversions in subsequent years to make this feel like anything more than a nostalgia trip. Finally, we get to play Tetris on the Genesis, and wow, was the Game Boy version better. I mean, this is still Tetris, and it has a 2-player mode, so it's still a really great game, but even compared to the Tetris versions on the market back in 1990, the Genesis game is just way behind the curve. Does anyone remember that Vectorman was sort of positioned as an answer to the pre-rendered graphics in Nintendo's Donkey Kong Country? Or is that all in my head? I'm not really sure anymore. Vectorman is a decent platforming shooter that never really grabbed me. It is definitely action-packed, though. I'm a huge Wonder Boy fan, and Monster World is one of a handful of great action RPGs on the Genesis Mini. It's also the worst of the bunch, though, thanks to the incredibly slow action and short range of our hero's weapons. It's really hard to swallow when you consider that this is the sequel to Dragon's Trap, which is a masterpiece. Darius is a hard one to place since it's an entirely new game for the Genesis. I have no idea how similar it is to the coin-op, but it definitely plays better than Sagaya from my short time with it. I'm looking forward to digging into this one a lot more in the future. Comix Zone is a wonderfully original idea that's executed almost perfectly. Hopping from frame to frame of a living comic book to beat up bad guys is just a fantastic idea, but the game is way too hard. I've always wanted to like Comix Zone more than I do, but every time I play it, I'm reminded why I don't. Golden Axe is another nostalgia item, but it's a pretty darn good port of the original arcade game. As a two-player game, it really holds up well all these years later. I have to say this is my favorite of the 3 Golden Axe games on the Genesis, so I'm glad it was included in the lineup. Ecco the Dolphin was just the weirdest idea ever back when it was released. Who ever heard of a non-violent game where you play as a dolphin? But it really works. It's a great game. It's super difficult. Even if you didn't have to constantly search for air pockets in order to replenish Ecco's ever-diminishing oxygen supply, it would still be difficult, but I love it to death. Super Phantasy Zone is a nice addition to the Genesis Mini when you consider that it's one of the few games on the list that never officially came out in North America. Phantasy Zone is such an important part of Sega's history that it's nice to be able to experience this solid port. One of the best moves Sega made early on in the Genesis life was to cut a deal with Capcom to port their arcade games to the system. Ghouls and Ghosts was one of the best of these, reprogrammed by Yuji Naka himself. And it's still better than Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Vertical fire for life. Sega and Capcom made a big deal of their official partnership. Who remembers images of Mega Man and Sonic shaking hands? I remember being so excited to play Mega Man on the Genesis, and so disappointed that it was only available on the Sega channel, which I couldn't access. Mega Man 1 through 3 are included here and are pretty decent, though not as good as the NES versions. And remember, there's a 4th game to unlock here. Genesis does the first 8 meg cartridge on a home console. Strider truly brought the arcade home in 1990. This game looks and sounds almost as good as the coin-op, and was sufficient to blow so many of us away back then. Time has shown that the gameplay here is actually pretty shallow, but I still have a great time playing it. How many of you out there knew Treasure had released an action RPG on the Genesis? I don't have a lot of experience with Light Crusader, mostly because it didn't grab me enough to keep me playing past the first couple hours, but I'm looking forward to giving it an honest go now that it's on the Genesis Mini. I just don't know where to find the time, what with all the other RPGs on this console. Like, say, Beyond Oasis. This always felt like the perfect mix of Zelda and the animation quality of an Aladdin or Earthworm Jim. Even today, Beyond Oasis still looks fantastic. Plus, it's got all those pretty cutscenes. I'm glad it made the cut because I feel like not a whole lot of people have actually played this one. ToeJam Earl is the game that made roguelikes funky. While some moments can get a bit intense in this game, it's mostly fun to just chill, walk around, and check out all the gags. Cupid singing and the crazy dentist's laugh are still my 2 favorite clips. I love this game. Most people have heard of or played Castle Evolution, which is also on the Genesis Mini, but I feel like many will be experiencing World Evolution for the first time. Do yourself a favor and play this with a friend. As a single-player game, it's a lot of fun, but as a co-op game, it really shines. Monster World 4 was forever that game you heard of that was so good, what a shame it was never translated to English. Well, that was rectified a few consoles ago, but it's nice to see this great game get another official release. The more people who get to play it, the better. It really feels like the Monster World series perfected. I have such fond memories of Dynamite Headdy, but I haven't really played it in years. It's so bizarre and refreshing, with a play mechanic that feels distantly related to that found in Kid Chameleon, but done so much better. I'm looking forward to diving into this one again. Earthworm Jim was the culmination of the amazing Disney games from Virgin, with the creativity unleashed by the crew at Shiny after they freed themselves from having to produce one licensed game after another. I remember buying this game and beating it on the same night, but I wasn't a bit disappointed about it. Road Rash is the secret best racing series of the 16-bit era, and I'm so excited to see it finally represented on a classic games compilation. It's a crime that this series has been dormant for so long. I hope thousands of people rediscover its greatness and it leads to a franchise revival. But probably not. Yet another action RPG on the Genesis Mini. Landstalker can be a bit difficult up front, what with the isometric view and lack of shadows making some jumps a bit dicey. But seriously, it's not hard to get over that hump and enjoy a fantastic little adventure game with tons of charm. Even without a 6-button controller, Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition still rocks. Yeah, okay, the voices, whatever. I'm still a huge Street Fighter II fan. If Sega had included 6-button controllers with the Genesis Mini, this one would rank a lot higher on the list. The Fire Emblem series is great, but it makes me so sad that the Shining Force franchise isn't around anymore. This is extremely accessible strategy role-playing with a great cast of characters, a wonderful soundtrack, and all kinds of style. Plus, those battle scenes are still some of my all-time favorites. Alisia Dragoon is the definition of a hidden gem. This action game features a unique battle system and a bevy of animal companions who can all be upgraded and bring their own offensive capabilities to the battle. It's one of the lesser-known Game Arts games and features the involvement of animation studio Gainax of Neon Genesis Evangelion fame. People heap praise on Contra Hardcore, and for good reason. This intense shooter felt like the next evolution of the Contra franchise at the time. But as for me, I never really got into it thanks to the punishing difficulty. Thank goodness the Japanese version, which includes a life bar, can be played on the Genesis Mini. Now wimps like me get to enjoy this technical masterpiece. Castle of Illusion was the big surprise of the Genesis Mini announcement in my mind. We've assumed for a long time that licensed games like this just wouldn't get re-releases, although it's been happening with so much more frequency now. I'm so excited that people will have yet another way to experience this classic game. I feel like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is the game most late adopters think about when they think Genesis, and that's fine, because it's an incredible game. You can take advantage of the squishy, split-screen multiplayer or just have Tails follow you around, basking in every one of his deaths. Thunder Force 3 was one of the earliest shooters on the Genesis, and it's still one of my favorites. Technosoft was on top of its game with this one, with beautiful, colorful graphics, intense action, and one of the most underrated soundtracks around. Because the Genesis was not well known for its role-playing games, in spite of having some of the greats, not nearly enough people have experienced Phantasy Star 4, which is a real shame because any list of the greatest 16-bit RPGs should have it sitting right next to the likes of Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. Speaking of Genesis games that should sit alongside the best in their genre, Castlevania Bloodlines fits that mold perfectly. No limp whips here, just hard-as-nails vampire killing featuring two characters who play completely different from one another. Plus, Bloodlines features one of the best soundtracks in the whole series. The Revenge of Shinobi and Shadow Dancer are both classics, but the best Shinobi is on the Genesis Mini. Shinobi 3 is a perfect example of late-generation development on the system. There are so many cool visual techniques being used in this game. Plus, it never fails to impress me just how versatile Joe Musashi's moveset is. It's sure a far cry from the shuriken-throwing original. The original Sonic is still the best Sonic, in my opinion. This game is like comfort food. I can practically play it blindfolded. Sonic the Hedgehog was Sega showing the world that it was much more than a maker of incredible arcade games, that it could stand toe-to-toe with the best home consoles had to offer. Treasure's first game is still my favorite. Gunstar Heroes holds up so well even today, and almost immediately made the Contra games feel a bit stale upon release. Each level feels different from the last, and the weapon combo system gives you a lot of different options for every situation. This game is so good. The best beat 'em up ever. Ever. Streets of Rage 2 immediately eclipsed every beat 'em up before it and set a new standard for the genre. Streets of Rage 3 was a step back in my opinion. The series reached perfection with the second game, not to mention one of the greatest soundtracks of all time, courtesy of Yuzo Koshiro. And that's that. The 42 games of the Genesis Mini ranked. I'm so happy that Sega has joined the mini console crowd and produced such a nice package. If you want to know more about these games and all others released for the Genesis and Mega Drive, be sure to check out the other videos here on Generation 16. I also want to give a huge thank you to Corey Carlson from My Life in Gaming for helping me track down some B-roll and allowing me to use some of his unboxing footage. Thanks for watching.